My name is Adrian. For 40 years, I was a priest of the Orthodox Church, dedicating my life to faith, service, and tradition. Since my youth, I was taught that the world was transient and that true existence began after death, where we would be judged and, if faithful, welcomed in the divine presence. My life was disciplined, prayers at dawn, rigorous fasts, endless confessions, passionate sermons about heaven and hell. I preached the certainty that death was not the end, but the beginning of eternity with God. And when my time came, I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The disease that consumed me was cruel, but it did not frighten me. While my body failed, my mind remained steadfast in the hope of paradise. I remember my last breath, surrounded by family and the faithful who prayed for my soul. I waited for the ecstasy of the passage, for the radiance of angels, for the indescribable peace I had promised so many times in my sermons. But when I opened my eyes, if I can call them that, there was no light, no celestial hymns, no comforting touch of God, only an absolute pitch darkness, a cold and suffocating void. And for the first time in my life, I felt fear. I tried to move, but there was no body. I tried to speak, but there was no sound. I was only consciousness, floating in an oppressive nothingness, without time, without direction. I had never conceived of anything like this, a state where existence continues, but without any sensory reference. My spirit, or whatever was left of me, longed for God. I cried out in thought, "Lord, I am here, bring me into your presence." But there was no answer, no glorious vision, no consolation, only silence. A silence that seemed alive, as if there were something there, something lurking, waiting. Then the whispers began, first distant like an invisible echo resonating through the void. Voices without language, without origin, hissing words I did not understand, but felt. And what I felt was pure terror. Their sound intertwined, forming a chorus of unsettling murmurs, sliding around me like snakes in the dark. Each word was a poison to the soul, charged with something profane, something ancient. They were not just voices, they were presences. Something was moving in the darkness, something that saw me, recognized me, something that was coming for me. I felt a deep cold, not like the cold of the earth, but a chill that coiled within my very essence, as if trying to tear me from existence. Shadows began to form around me, not ordinary shadows, but living darkness, contorting into impossible shapes. They had no faces, yet I could feel their eyes, or something worse than eyes, fixed on me. And then one of them whispered my name, Adrian, a drawn-out whisper that shouldn't have been possible, for there was no air, no real sound. But I heard it. Inside me, at the very core of my consciousness, I heard that thing calling me. And in that instant, I understood what true fear was. I had spent my life preaching about hell, yet I had never known what it was to feel its presence. Those shadows were not just entities. They were intelligences, beings that existed outside of time, that knew me in a way I did not even know myself. And they were drawing near. There was no escape, no place to run. I tried to pray, tried to cry out for God, but the more I prayed, the more they laughed, not with sound, but with a malignant vibration that reverberated within me. The only certainty remaining was that I should not be there. Something was terribly wrong. Then they advanced, not as something physical, but as an overwhelming force, an invisible weight pulling me into them. It was as if they wanted to consume me, disintegrate me, make me part of that nothingness. The sensation was worse than any physical pain I had ever felt. It was absolute despair, a terror that existed not only around me, but within me. My very being was being drained, sucked away by that darkness. I wanted to scream, but I had no voice. I wanted to fight, but I had no body. All I had was my consciousness, and even that was unraveling. It was then, at the height of my despair, that the light appeared. Not an ordinary light, but something purer, more intense than anything I had ever seen. In the moment it appeared, the shadows recoiled, writhing in silent agony, dissolving into the darkness, as if being burned away. The light grew, enveloping everything around me, and then I saw him. At the center of that celestial glow, he was there, Jesus Christ, but not as I had imagined him, not like a painting, a statue, or a church image. He was real, more real than anything I had ever known. His gaze pierced my soul, and in that instant, I knew that everything I thought I knew about him was incomplete. I couldn't take my eyes off him. There was something in his gaze that completely disarmed me. He saw me not as a priest, not as a servant of the church, but as I truly was. I felt naked before him, not in a physical sense, but as if my soul were exposed. Every mistake, every doubt, every moment I preached without truly understanding. And then he spoke, but not with common words. His voice was like both thunder and a whisper at the same time, resonating within me, filling every void of my existence. "You preached about me, but you never truly knew me." That phrase struck me like a blow. My mind refused to accept it. I had dedicated my entire life to him. I had fasted, prayed, followed every tradition, every ritual. How could I not know him? But then, like a veil being torn away, I saw myself, decades ago, a young seminarian more concerned with dogma than with the living presence of God. I saw the sermons I had given, mechanical, laden with authority, but empty of true connection. I saw people seeking comfort in my church, only to leave with the same emptiness with which they entered. And the worst part, I saw how I had taken pride in my own sanctity without realizing that my heart had never truly surrendered. It was a devastating blow. Everything I believed to be my greatest virtue revealed itself as my greatest flaw. My pride had been hidden under the mantle of faith. My obedience was not to the living Christ, but to a system, a structure that, in the end, had distanced me from him. I felt shame, a shame burning more fiercely than even the terror of those shadows. I wanted to justify myself, to say that I had always tried to be a man of God, that I had done the best I could. But before him, excuses were meaningless. Jesus did not need explanations. He saw everything, and then, without condemnation but with infinite sadness, he showed me something even more terrible. I saw the world as he saw it. Churches filled to the brim yet devoid of his presence. Men at the pulpit speaking in his name, yet not truly knowing him. The gospel being molded to please rather than to transform. I saw multitudes of believers seeking solace, yet being fed with empty words, with rituals that were nothing more than lifeless shells. I saw alliances formed with earthly power, religious leaders more concerned with influence than with holiness. Religion had become a spectacle, and Christ, a distant figure, used to justify everything except the truth. My heart ached as I realized I was part of that. I wanted to look away, but it was impossible. Every scene was etched into my soul like an open wound. I saw the faithful singing praises, but without understanding the words that came from their lips. I saw pastors turning the altar into a stage, selling promises like merchants in a temple. I saw dark alliances being forged between religious leaders and those who sought earthly power. And above all, I saw something terrifying. I saw churches full, yet with Jesus on the outside, ignored, forgotten, while inside, multitudes followed doctrines that had nothing to do with him. It was then that I understood the depth of what was happening. The evil I had felt in the darkness was not something personal. It was not a punishment for me. It was a reflection of something much larger. True faith was disappearing, being replaced by something empty, something sterile. I saw that many, like me, believed they were on the right path, but were merely trapped in an illusion of religiosity. And then Jesus spoke again. "Go back, tell the truth. Some will listen." The light began to fade, but not as if it were being taken from me. It was as if I were being thrown back, an abrupt tug, as if my soul were being ripped from that place and hurled back. I felt an impact, as if I had fallen from a great height, and then, suddenly, air filled my lungs. My eyes opened, and what I saw was the white ceiling of a hospital. Voices emerged around me, shouts, astonishment, people crying. I was back. Doctors and nurses were running around me, and I realized that my family was there, eyes wide as if they had seen a dead man rise. And in fact, that was exactly what had happened. The first thing Vi tried to do was speak, but my throat was dry as if I hadn't used my voice in centuries. It took me a few seconds to understand where I was and what had happened. I had died, but now I was here again. The doctors couldn't explain it. My cardiac arrest had been definitive. I had been declared dead, with no brain activity whatsoever. Yet, against all logic, I had returned, and with a purpose. The mission Jesus had given me burned within me. I needed to speak. I needed to tell what I had seen. I tried to sit up in bed, still weak, while my family wept and embraced me. But my mind was focused on one thing. I needed to tell what had happened. My voice came out trembling, yet firm. I saw Jesus, was all I managed to say at first. The shock was immediate. Some made the sign of the cross, others just stared at me, waiting for me to say more. Then I began to relate. I recounted the darkness, the shadows, the terror of being separated from God. And then I spoke of the light, of the living presence of Christ, of how everything I believed to be faith was, in truth, merely an empty ritual. But as I spoke, I realized that not everyone wanted to listen. My fellow priests, who had prayed at my side for years, exchanged dubious glances. One of them interrupted me. "Adrian, you were delirious. The brain can play tricks when one is dying." But I knew it wasn't delirium. How could it be? Never in my life had I felt something so real, so overwhelming. I saw the state of the church with my own spiritual eyes. I saw the truth. But the truth was uncomfortable. I insisted. "You don't understand. I died. I saw what lies beyond this world. I saw the truth." My voice trembled, not from fear, but from urgency. I needed them to believe, at least to hear me. But the looks around me began to change. The initial astonishment transformed into something else, something uncomfortable. My older brother, Jean, who had always been a skeptical man, crossed his arms and shook his head. "Adrien, you went through a trauma. You're confused. The mind can create illusions when the body is collapsing." He tried to rationalize me, to fit me into a comfortable explanation, but there was no comfort in what I saw. There was nothing that could be explained by mere hallucinations. My mother, a devout woman who never missed a single mass, gripped my hand tightly as if to prevent me from saying anything more. Her eyes were brimming, but full of fear. "Son, be careful with what you say. You might be deceived." It struck me like a stab to the chest. Deceived? I had seen the truth more clearly than I had ever seen anything in this world. But then a frightening thought crossed my mind. What if the people around me were not ready to listen? I realized at that moment that the truth revealed to me was not for everyone. Some simply did not want to see. Others were so entrenched in their comfortable beliefs that they preferred to reject anything that challenged them. I looked around, trying to find a familiar face that showed understanding, someone who could at least consider that what I was saying was real. But there was none. Everyone's eyes were filled with uncertainty, incredulity, and, what hurt the most, fear. The idea that someone could die, cross over, and return with a message contrary to what they believed was simply unacceptable to many. The fear of the unknown kept them locked within the barriers of their doctrines, and they were not willing to open their minds to something that defied everything they had learned. "Do you think I'm crazy?" I asked, feeling frustration boil within me. "Do you think I made all this up? That my spirit simply created a convenient illusion while my body was dying? So tell me, why would I, a priest who followed the church all my life, see something so contrary to what I preached? If it were a hallucination, I would have seen angels. I would have seen the paradise I always expected to find. But I didn't see. I saw the truth, and the truth is that we were deceived. The faith we practice is not enough. The churches are full, but Christ is absent." The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. Some people lowered their heads, unable to meet my gaze. Others looked at me as if I were a stranger, a man who had gone mad after a near-death experience. But one person approached, one of the doctors who had attended to me. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a deep gaze marked by years of experience dealing with death. "Father," he said softly, "I have seen people return from death before, but I have never seen anyone speak with so much conviction and with such fear in their eyes." He hesitated, then added, "What you saw, it changes everything for you, doesn't it?" I nodded slowly. "Not only for me, for everyone, but few will want to listen." The doctor fell silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then he sighed and said something that sent shivers down my spine. "Father, I have heard other accounts like yours, but most of the people who come back, they don't speak. They are afraid of being discredited, afraid of losing everything. Society does not like those who challenge its worldview." His words echoed inside me like thunder, because he was right. I knew that if I continued to recount my experience, I would lose much: my position in the church, the trust of those who once admired me, perhaps even my freedom to preach. But how could I be silent after what I had seen? The truth burned inside me, raging like a fire that could not be extinguished. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. I couldn't continue living as before, preaching the same sermons that now sounded empty to me. "If I do not speak, I become complicit," I murmured, more to myself than to anyone present. My mother squeezed my hand even tighter. "Son, please, think carefully. You know what might happen if you persist with this." I knew. I would be called a heretic, a madman, a liar. Perhaps I would be expelled from the church. But what is the church without Christ? What is faith without the truth? The decision had already been made within me, even before I voiced it. I could never return to my former life, pretending that nothing had happened. How could I go up to the altar, look at a congregation, and preach words that now felt empty? I needed to speak, to share what I had seen, even if no one was willing to listen. I swallowed hard and raised my eyes to my mother, to my fellow priests, to the doctors and nurses who still observed me in silence. "I cannot be silent," I declared, feeling the weight of those words in my chest. "Even if you do not believe, even if it costs me everything, I need to tell the truth." My brother Jean let out an incredulous laugh and shook his head. "So that's it? You're going to go out there saying the church is wrong? That the priests, the faithful, everyone has been deceived?" His voice was laden with skepticism, but also with something more. Something I wasn't sure was fear or anger. I maintained my steady gaze on him. "I'm not saying that faith is wrong, Jean. I'm saying that it has been corrupted. That churches have become stages. That we preach empty words. That we speak of a Christ we do not truly know. I was one of them. I did that. But now I know what I saw." My brother snorted, crossing his arms, his expression hardening. "And what exactly do you expect to achieve with that, Adrian? Do you think you can change everything on your own? That you can just go out there screaming that the church is corrupted and people will believe you?" His voice was thick with sarcasm, yet beneath it lay something deeper, a silent desperation, a fear that perhaps I was right. "I don't expect to change everything," I replied, my voice firm, "but I hope to reach those who still have ears to listen. If there is a single soul that understands what I'm saying, then it's already worth it." The doctor, who had listened to me earlier, nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "Father, if what you say is true, and I'm not saying that I believe it or not, but if it is true, then you are carrying an enormous burden. People do not like having their certainties challenged. What you saw may change lives, but it can also spark hatred. Are you prepared for that?" His words hung in the air, heavy as lead. I knew I was right. I knew that the truth was not welcome. But how could I turn back now? I took a deep breath, feeling a strange peace within me, even in the face of the rejection surrounding me. I was torn from eternity for this. If I remain silent, it will be as if I died again. The silence in the room was absolute. Some people averted their eyes, others seemed restless, as if struggling against something within themselves. But I did not expect immediate acceptance. The truth has a strange effect on people. It can illuminate, but it can also burn. So, what will you do now? Jean asked, his voice colder, more distant. Looked at him, at my mother, at the other priests who seemed to have already decided that I was lost. I will speak, I replied simply. I will tell what I saw, no matter what happens. My mother began to cry softly. I knew she feared for my future, for what might happen to me if I continued with this. But something inside me no longer belonged to this world in the same way. I had seen the other side. I had seen the truth. I knew I would face scorn, rejection, perhaps even persecution, but I also knew that, in the end, it didn't matter how many listened, as long as I had returned for a reason, and I would fulfill that mission until my last breath. In the following days, my story spread. Some sought me out in secret, asking to hear more, searching for answers their hearts had long suspected, but never dared admit. Others publicly ridiculed me, saying I had gone mad, that my mind had been affected by death. Within the church itself, I began to be treated as a problem, an inconvenience, that needed to be silenced. I received warnings, well-intentioned advice to forget my experience and move on. But how do you forget something like that? How do you erase from the soul a truth that was written in fire? So I did the only thing I could. I went to the altar where I had preached so many times, looked at the faithful sitting in the pews, waiting for the same words they had heard all their lives, and said, I died. And when I returned, I discovered that many churches still stand, but Christ is no longer in them. The murmuring was immediate. Some stood up and left, outraged. Others stayed, shocked, waiting to see what I would say next. But at that moment, I understood something profound. I had not returned to convince anyone. I had returned to give a warning. The rest was up to them.